Micah, and correcting or correction with Abe. And so your lesson, my lesson, has two initial intentions. One, how do we as parents and or mentors encourage or correct? How can our young people be encouraged or encouragers? And so you see here that Andy also included the idea of mentors. We recognize that not all children have parents, either actual orphans or in a broken world, we have different levels of brokenness within homes. One or more parent not present, or in some cases, parents that are present but have either checked out mentally, emotionally, or spiritually. And so this lesson is also for couples that may have opportunities to encourage children, or singles who may have opportunities to encourage children. So I'll be talking about parents and children, but recognize that as we speak, these same concepts apply to anyone who has the opportunity to encourage a child. So encouraging children, and again, the idea is how do we as parents and or mentors encourage or correct children? So encouraging children. It's a good thing to be the last speaker of the month, because then you get to have the opportunity to sort of restate and repackage what the other speakers have said. That's a nice way to say plagiarize. And the idea there is that I can take what people have said and use that as my lesson. And we'll try to add to that. But I want to thank the guys who have spoken already and recognize their efforts in providing encouragement for us and encouraging each other. So encouraging children. Annie talked about to encourage like Jesus. So I would encourage you to go listen to Andy's lesson. I won't be able to do it justice. And apply those concepts that he talked about specifically to encouraging children. And so just as a high level of what Andy talked about, he gave us a definition of encourage, a biblical scriptural definition to be close beside, or to call, to come up beside, to call out to. And so we see to encourage, you have to have both proximity and communication. Both are required. Yes.
Only the left half of your presentation is showing. I'm not sure if that's on your end. Several other people are noticing the same thing.
Well, there's probably nothing I can do about it at this point, so I'm just going to forge ahead. I'll apologize. So again, the idea of being close beside or communicating with, you would think would be something natural that would occur in a home with a child, but oftentimes it's not. And so Jesus formed intentional, invested relationships. That is, something that he had to work at. Not all relationships are the same. No two relationships are the same. So Jesus formed intentional, invested relationships in order to encourage people, and we need to do the same thing with children. Again, we make an investment in financial matters so that we can get a return. In this case, we are investing so that Christ can get a return, so that God can get a return. The idea is to encourage children to follow Jesus and share our goal and purpose in drawing others to him. And again, that assumes that we have that goal and purpose to share. And so there may be some background work on our part before we even are able to share that with our children. Jesus with Peter, as he encouraged Simon to become Peter, focused not on his failures, but on a response, his response to failure, and how the child will be useful afterward. And we need to do the same thing with children as Jesus did with Peter. We often tend to focus on the failure, but we need to be focusing on how they are going to respond, and then how they can be made useful after they have responded to that failure. And a quote from Andy's lesson was, being an encourager means I'm going to invest my time and energy and see it through to its end. The idea is that I'm not going to bail on this relationship once things get messy or once things get difficult, that I am invested and I'm going to stay invested and see that through to its end, working with you as my child and encouraging you so that you can be useful, so that you can do the things that we talked about above, that we can follow Jesus and share that goal and purpose of drawing others to him. So these all go together. So that is the idea of encouraging like Jesus. Micah talked about bearing burdens as a means of encouragement. And so again, I would encourage you to go listen to Micah's lesson and apply those things directly to encouraging children and bearing their burdens. And so Micah had 2 points as he talked about bearing burdens. The first was to remind people, in this case, remind children of the wonderful blessings that have been promised and that we enjoy in Christ. And the second was to remind children that they have great value, that they are capable of something amazing in providing service to the Lord, and then motivate them, direct them in doing that. So what kind of burdens might children be bearing? Maybe that would be somewhat more unique to them than to others. Are they being bullied in school? Or do they feel unattractive, unintelligent, unathletic, unliked, uncool, unpopular, or any other unword that's negative that no one likes to feel? Are they being persecuted for following Jesus? Do they feel like they don't understand their own feelings or their purpose, or no one understands them? These are some of the burdens that children might be experiencing. And often when we think about some of those things, we deal with those by listening and advocating and protecting and sort of cheerleading and not diminishing any of those. But Micah was helping us to see the scriptural model for bearing those burdens is to, in those instances and those burdens, remind the children of the wonderful blessings that they have been promised. You can go to the book of Ephesians and just be overwhelmed in the first half about what we have in Christ, the promises that have been made. And also remind children that they have great value, and look at them and recognize what they are capable of, what they can be capable of, and doing something amazing for the service of God. And it's the idea of doing something great in God's service. It doesn't matter whether they end up being an open heart surgeon or splitting the atom or driving the garbage truck. Parents tend to talk to their children and tell them about the great things that they can become, the great things they can do, and it's often aimed toward what they can do as a profession. But recognize when we're talking about bearing the burden and reminding them about the great things they can do, the great things they can become, it's aimed toward what they can do in service to God. So that garbage truck driver who is kind and humble and sacrificial and shares the good news of Jesus and honors God is infinitely more valuable to God than that really highly accomplished brain surgeon who is unkind, arrogant, selfish, and ungodly. So again, focusing on what really matters in regards to the great value that those children have. And then finally, from the lessons that we've looked at this month, provide correction as encouragement. Abe made the point that correction is encouragement. I don't know that he used an exclamation point, but I think it is deserving of one. Correction is encouragement. That's the whole point of it. Abe talked about several definitions that weren't very helpful, but he gave us an extremely helpful definition. We talked about encouragement or correction, that correction is to return to use, to bring back to or put back into a form or original state. And he helped us out there understanding that the original state is an image-bearing state, to renew. So what could be more encouraging than that? To be in a state where you're not useful and you're not bearing the image, of Christ. Now you've been corrected and you are useful and are back in a state where you can bear Christ's image. We should be excited to be corrected, recognizing that that is the goal and that's what's really going on when we are being corrected. And so it takes a little bit of an attitude adjustment. It takes a little bit of a looking through a different lens, is I think the term that Abe used, as we view correction in a biblical way, a scriptural way, that it's for our benefit in becoming useful to God, useful to the kingdom. We also need to, when we think about correcting as encouragement, help the child bear the burden of receiving correction as encouragement. Abe talked about when there is a situation where correction is needed, you have the corrector and the correctee, and both of those are bearing a burden. Both of those have something weighing on them. And it's incumbent on the adult, the parent, the mature one, hopefully the mature spiritually, to help that child bear their burden of receiving that correction as encouragement, to deliver it in a way that it is encouraging, to explain it in a way to demonstrate and explain what the end goal is. So to help the child bear the burden of receiving correction as encouragement. Now I could probably stop there and say go and do likewise, but I think there's an expectation that I'll add at least something of my own to this lesson. So just talk a little bit about a how-to. So a little more direct application maybe of encouraging children. So talk about that for just a few minutes. The go-to passage for encouraging children is Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And I hope you can agree that if we really consider what encouragement is about, that we could restate that in context of our study for this month and say, fathers, don't discourage your children, but encourage them. And I hope we can also see that the concepts applied beyond fathers, even though this instruction is specifically to fathers, that anyone who hopes to encourage a child, don't discourage them, but encourage them. So really the first step then is don't discourage. If you want to encourage your children, start by not discouraging them. The medical credo is the first thing is to do no harm. If you have a situation where someone comes to you and is injured or is sick, if you do nothing else, at least don't make things worse. And unfortunately, parents can often make things worse by discouraging a child. So that's the first way you can encourage a child is by stopping discouraging them. There's a reference at the bottom of the page here to a book. I was talking to Melissa about this lesson, and she recommended this book, The Heart of Anger. The first chapter in that book is Angry Kids. The second chapter in that book is Provocative Parents. And it's a recognition that anger in kids can often come because parents are provoking that anger. And so this author, Lou Priolo, comes up with a list of 25 ways that parents provoke their children to anger. And if you do an internet search, you can find similar lists. And if you combine them, you could probably come up with more than 25 things. So here's the list, and this particular author uses. And my first reaction when I see that list is, man, that's a long list. There's a lot of things on that list, a lot of ways that parents can provoke their children to anger. The second thing I noticed about that list is it includes things that are both done, things that are committed, you might say, and things that are undone, things that are omitted, things that are neglected. And so if you ever find yourself saying, I'm not doing anything to provoke anger, well, maybe that's part of the problem. There's something you should be doing and you're not, and that is provoking anger in your child. Another thing I do when I look at a list like this, not just this specific list, but any of these long lists of things that can be somewhat negative, I go in and I look for some quick wins for myself. So I scan down through and I get down to like maybe number 17 there, chasing in front of others. And I think, no, I don't do that. And number 20, mocking, no, I don't do that. Abusing physically, no, I don't do that. Ridiculing or name calling. And so those give me some quick wins. And I feel like, yeah, I'm doing pretty good. But as I continue to look down that list, I very quickly begin to wince and cringe because I recognize that in my parenting, I've done a lot of things on that list. And so I am guilty of doing things that can provoke my children to anger. And that's a humbling experience when you recognize that. The counselor here, this Lou Priolo, counsels with families, and he spoke specifically about counseling with families that had children with anger issues. And so the family comes to him, the child has an anger issue, and the counselor starts with the parents. He spends the first couple, 3 sessions talking to them and begins working with them on things on this list. And it's extremely interesting that what he has found is that when he works with the parents for a couple, 3 weeks, and the parents begin working on some of these things that they recognize that they're doing, the behavior of the child improves. And in fact, he has found more than once, not always the case, that he doesn't even need to counsel with a child. The time he spends counseling with the parents and identifying things that they're doing that to provoke their children to anger, to discourage their children, they're able to eliminate, and suddenly the anger issue that the child had seems to disappear. And so it really brings home the point of the extremely powerful influence negatively that we can have on our children. I recognize that we're responsible for our own actions. We talked about that. Micah talked about that. We each bear our own burden. We're responsible for our own actions. And it's true that I can't make anybody angry, but it's also true that I can provoke them to anger because the Bible warns about doing just that. And so the very first thing we can do if we want to encourage our children is stop discouraging them. We'll go a long way toward encouraging them by stop doing discouraging things. So Paul writes, don't discourage them, but encourage them. And he writes it as, bring them up in the discipline of the Lord. This is a slide that was lifted directly from Abe's lesson. How do we normally view correction? And so Abe listed and quickly read these passages from the Proverbs. And these are, you might say, are the kind of the spare the rod, spoil the child passages. And Abe's point in looking at these was, as we read through these and we see these actions being talked about, that as we look at these all together, it gives us a very negative view of correction. And his point in his lesson was that we shouldn't view correction as negative. It's a very positive thing, as we already talked about, because it is encouragement. If you look at this list, the ones that I've highlighted by bold and making italic are specifically talking about children and activities toward children. And the point that I want to make in looking at this list is that anytime we tend to talk about discipline, if you've ever been in a Bible class talking about disciplining children, it seems that we quickly come to passages like this. And the whole intent is to justify corporal punishment. In other words, we are providing the proof text that supports our spanking of our children. And setting aside what those passages are actually talking about when they're talking about the rod, that's worthy of a study on its own. Jumping through these passages as a means to justify corporal punishment really misses the whole point and focus of what discipline is really all about. And that's the point that I want to make. We're talking about bringing them up in the discipline of the Lord. Discipline is talking about instruction. Discipline is talking about training. Discipline is talking about a whole life of raising a child and directing them in the proper direction. And so when we think about discipline, let's focus on discipline as a positive character trait rather than a punitive action. Discipline is a character trait that we want our children to have. Like a Marine has discipline. A Marine is disciplined. And so our disciplining of our children is to get them to possess discipline, that positive character trait. Focus more on that and much less on the punitive action as people often think about when they think about the word discipline. And I'd like to talk about using the lane correction model versus the invisible fence model. So Abe talked about the lane correction model. You remember he talked about being behind someone when they're driving on a wet road, and you can see their tracks that the tires have left, and you see that they're not perfectly straight. There is a little bit of back and forth as a driver, even unconsciously, is making tiny course corrections constantly to keep between the center line and the fog line on the side of the road. That's the model we want to use when we're talking about disciplining kids versus the invisible fence model. Now, the invisible fence model, I'll talk about our dog, Barney. Some of you remember the dog we had, Barney. He was a golden retriever. He was with us for 16 years, and he was a great dog. We were not worthy of him. But Barney was not perfect. Barney was a bit of a roamer. He tended to leave our property, and we failed as pet owners to restrain that. And Barney was also a bit of a small animal assassin. It was surprising that for such an amiable dog towards people and other dogs, even to the point where he would submit to dogs that were a fraction of his size, when it came to any of the small animals, all Barney wanted to do was kill them. And so this is a picture of Barney that you probably can't see if your half the screen's cut off. But the up in the corner was some animal shaming, pet shaming I did on his behalf. Now that particular incident was never proven, that accusation, but there were other incidents. And the final straw was when Barney got caught red-pawed in a neighbor's chicken coop with a dead chicken. That's when we realized we needed to keep Barney on our property. So I installed the invisible fence. If you're familiar with that, you get the buried cable, and the dog wears a collar that provides him a electric shock if he crosses the fence. It doesn't harm him. I know that because I tried it on myself, but it does give him an unpleasant experience and a frightening experience that he wants to avoid, and that keeps him away from that invisible perimeter. So you have to train the dog how to interact with the invisible fence. You put little flags around the perimeter, and then you get out there, him on a leash, and you train him getting close to the flags, and he gets an audible alert and learns that I need to stay away from this perimeter. Well, the last thing you have to do, the last step, the true test, is for you as the trainer to step across the boundary and then coax your dog to come and really feel the full brunt, you might say, of what happens if he crosses. And so Barney trusts me. I call him to me, and he gets zapped. And he runs to the front porch, and I go check on him, and he is literally crying. He has tears streaming out of his eyes. It was a very unpleasant experience for both of us. He was crying. I think I was almost crying. I felt like a total heel for doing that to him. And it was just very unpleasant. I don't think Barney trusted me much after that, at least for a time. And I can't say that I blame him. And the whole point of that is we want to use the lane correction model, making slight, sometimes almost imperceptible corrections to keep inside the lines rather than this invisible fence model, and wait until the boundary is crossed and then punishment comes. because it's unpleasant for everyone, and it affects the relationship, and it can affect trust. And so let's try as much as possible, as we are discipline, training, and instruction in raising our children, to use the lane correction model, not the invisible fence model. And then finally, focus on transforming the heart instead of controlling behavior. I should have said at the beginning of this whole lesson that I don't approach this lesson from a position of strength. I go through this lesson and I see more than anything my failures in doing the things that I'm calling on you to do. So it's, as always, a situation, but more so probably in this lesson than others, of do what God says, not what I have done. And this particular one is maybe the one I regret the most. My parenting was a lot about controlling behavior, a lot about changing behavior, and not about transforming the heart. And we recognize as we need read Old and New Testament that the heart is the key to everything. If we can truly transform the heart, that behavior will follow. And so let's make sure we focus on what is really going to have the impact and make things much simpler down the road. And then bring them up in the instruction of the Lord. Again, discipline is the idea of a whole life training and raising. Instruction is more towards verbal, providing actual verbal instruction or teaching. As a family, we've been looking through the book of Proverbs recently, just reading through it and discussing it. As we went through chapters 2 through 7, noted that every single one of those chapters started with my son, or in the case of chapter 4, here, sons, the instruction that he was giving. This is the idea of providing instruction of the Lord, or in the Lord. And as you read through the book of Proverbs, you see that the practical application, the instruction that's being provided as a means to encourage the child. In those chapters, you read about wisdom, you read about the benefits of wisdom, the rewards of wisdom. You read about immorality versus purity, laziness, debt, pride, falsehood, evil companions, on and on it goes. Things that a child, things that an adult would need to live a life well that honors God. So don't discourage your children, for starters, but then seek a higher plane to raise them, to discipline, to train, and then also provide instruction in the Lord. And the final message, the final part of the lesson, and this will be brief. How can our young people be encouragers? And I did not make a list of all the things that our children can do to be encouragers. I would encourage you to do that, to brainstorm by yourself or with someone else or a group, to think about specific things that they can do to make contact, to serve. So what I want to do is think a little more high level, a little more conceptual level about what our young people can do to be encouragers. The first thing I noted here is to start in the home. We want to sometimes jump in and send people out all over the place. We really need to start in the home. I said here that our homes should be incubators for growing encouragers. In a safe environment of our home, this instruction for how to make encouragers, how our children can be encouragers, is where it should and can begin. So what about siblings? Can children encourage siblings? I said here, don't accept sibling rivalry and conflict as a given. Clearly, there are times that those things may happen, but just to accept that that is the way of life, that's the way it's going to be, don't buy into Satan's lie that that's the way it has to be. Cain said, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And the point was, he should have been. They were brothers. And instead of being in conflict and eventually murdering his brother, he should have been one who was able to encourage his brother in the Lord had things gone the way God had planned them to go. What about parents? I asked the question here, can a child encourage, bear burdens for, and even correct a parent? Can a child encourage, bear burdens for, and even correct a parent? Well, think back to the definitions we talked about and the methodology that we talked about. Micah talked about burden bearing, and he said, remember two critical things: to remind the other person about what is being or has been promised in Christ, and also to remind the other person about what they are capable of becoming in Christ. So the question is, can a child do that toward a parent? And what about correction? Can a child correct a parent? Well, remember that correction is encouraging, and correction is encouragement. And truth is truth no matter what or who the messenger. I just add a note here that the parents need to be humble enough to give your child permission, as it were, to correct you. If you truly want to have this as a relationship that goes back and forth, that is invested, then you're going to allow your parents, your children, you're going to give them permission to encourage you through even correction. And that's going to take humility. It's going to take humility for you to allow them to bear your burdens, and it's going to take humility for you to allow them to provide correction. And obviously, you have different stages of development and maturity in children, and you have to work through that with wisdom. But it should come to a point where you have the humility to be able to accept that even from your child. And then the last point here for children being encouragers is to obey, to be obedient. To obey the first time is exactly as it was asked, and do it with a good attitude. Now, I will say that the children, you should do that because God says so. You should do that because it honors your parents. But just know that you should also do that because it is an extremely encouraging thing for your parents. Any parent can tell you when you ask a child to do something, they do it the first time exactly as asked with a good attitude. That is just a shot in the arm. That's a drink of ice cold water that is so refreshing. And a parent who receives that with a proper attitude doesn't receive it as like, wow, I did a great job, I'm a good parent. They receive it with that higher vision of, wow, look what this child has done as a child of the King. They're honoring me. I'm encouraged by that. They're encouraged by that. We're all encouraged by that. So start in the home. And then outside the home, embrace the Jonathan model. When Andy was talking about encouraging others, he said, don't fall into the trap of trying to say, well, I'm going to encourage all 200, however many people at church, and make sure I do that every week, because that's just going to be discouraging. And so thinking about the Jonathan model, Jonathan and David. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, we read, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David and his armor and even his sword and his bow and his belt. You see a relationship here that is very close. Loved him as his own soul. And it's clear in the case of Jonathan that Jonathan was not about Jonathan. Jonathan was about David. Jonathan was about building up David. Jonathan was about providing for David and doing what was his best interest. In chapter 23, we read David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh. And Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. He encouraged him in God. And how did he do that? He said to him, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Saul my father also knows this." He strengthened his hand in God. He encouraged him by reminding him of the promise of the Almighty. And that's what we talked about earlier. To bear burdens by reminding one another, in this case, our child, in this case, a friend, about what God has done, what God has promised. And so when we think about how can our young people be encouragers, I would suggest maybe the Jonathan model. I don't know, it's perhaps conjecture on my part, how many close friends Jonathan had. But he had an amazing close friendship with one, and he encouraged that one and strengthened that one in God. And so the final verse, a man of many companions may come to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. When we think about how our young people can be encouragers, let's encourage them to not worry about having 50 friends, but having someone that they can be invested in, have a relationship with, that they can encourage and strengthen in God. Thanks for listening.